cultural conditions alone are not sufficient to create a political movement, particularly one strong enough to shift the center of power toward the right or the left in the U.S. body politic. That requires an organization and infrastructure to do. And so now I'd like to look not at the cultural conditions that prepared the soil for the rise of the new right, but I want to look at I want to describe the new right itself. Let's look at this. So we can ask the question, what is the new right? Well, we find that the new right is much more conservative than its predecessors, but it is less beholden to any particular political party. Now, in the previous lecture, I said that the Republican Party became more conservative. Remember, that took a lot of time. That took about 15 years to happen. But conservatives and the new right were not particularly concerned from the late 1950s into the 1970s about which political party they adhered to. They weren't ready for a political party yet. And it was only with certain happenstance and sometimes short-term political goals in mind that the Republican Party opened itself to an influx of new conservatives, while the Democratic Party opened itself to an influx of new social democrats. So in the beginning, in the 1960s in particular, the new right, which is just as identifiable as the so-called new left, were more conservative but less beholden to the discipline of a particular political party. We see the breakup, the conservative wing of the Democrats breaks off from the Democratic Party. Zell Miller said lately, and I mean very late in the doing of this, that he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him. Well, that's putting the blame maybe in the wrong place, but certainly that's one way to express it. Many Southern conservatives in particular felt like the Democratic Party had moved away from them. Many liberals in the Republican Party felt like the Republican Party was moving away from them as well. But conservatives did not care what party they were in. They began seeing themselves as conservatives. And one of the reasons they did this was because of the influence of William F. Buckley, pictured here, around whom the new right began to organize in the middle of the 1960s. One organization that identified itself as the harbinger of the new right was the Young Americans for Freedom. And in their Sharon Statement of 1960, preceded the SDS and the New Left by 2 years in issuing a statement of purpose. And their statement of purpose was about what you would expect it to be. It was support for capitalist economy and markets, a detestation of communism, demand that the American nation be militarily strong and predominant across the globe, and that it have a very, very muscular foreign policy with a very market-oriented domestic policy. The YAF, Young Americans for Freedom, identified themselves by dressing much like William Buckley is dressed in this picture on college campuses. YAF was young. They were kind of the flip side of the coin to the SDS. In 1962, having spread across college campuses, their national organization began identifying with particular politicians. When they honored Strom Thurmond, the longtime senator and former representative from South Carolina, who had been a Dixiecrat in the been the Dixiecratic presidential standard bearer in 1948, Dixiecrats were conservative Democrats primarily, who split with the party over the race issue and the threat of integrating the armed forces. Then Strong moved into the Republican Party and, boy, held his office until he was almost 100 years old, dying only a few years ago. They honored him in 1962, which really put them on the map as far as identifying themselves by political shorthand. They supported the Goldwater campaign in 1964, which tended to firm up their identification with the right wing of the Republican Party. And then in 1966, when he ran for governor of California, and 1968, when he ran for president, they supported Ronald Reagan. Now, the Young Americans for Freedom, much like the SDS split, they split in 1971 when the Libertarian wing of YAF split off and formed the Libertarian Party, because I guess the YAF just wasn't the right kind of conservative for the Libertarians. And in fact, they were not. They were bent in a different direction. Many times, the Young Americans for Freedom and the New Right identified after the 1960s with the overall neoconservative agenda. They emerged in the 1970s as a coherent or cohering group that had formed around the National Review. There were old YAFers hanging out with Buckley, and Buckley and the National Review kind of led the New Right by the mid-1970s. Neoconservatives attached themselves. These were former leftists who and former Democrats who had decided that we needed to be significantly more anti-communist in our foreign policy, and we see the influence of neoconservatives in our political system today. In fact, we argued about that from 2000 to 2010 pretty strongly. We see another group emerge as part of this coalition of the New Right, and that's corporate funders. They set up a number of conservative think tanks to provide political analysis and public relations in coordination with the National Review and with neoconservatives. Then we see that group of cultural conservatives, those politicized evangelicals, angry at the Supreme Court decisions that abolished prayer in school and the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. We also see among cultural conservatives the anti-feminist, anti-equal rights amendment conservatives joining forces with the New Right and forming another part of the coalition. The last group that tended to join the New Right were the tax revolters, people that wanted to either lower taxes or wanted particular kinds of taxes reduced or junked altogether. We see property tax limitation measures being pushed by this group at the local level. And we see probably the greatest manifestation of tax revolters until the Tea Party is the Sagebrush Rebellion of Western ranchers and timber interests and mining companies. They helped to fund these corporate think tanks, and they became part of this coalition of the New Right that went on in 1980 to elect the first New Right president, Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan was a conglomeration of a lot of things. He was not as right-wing as his rhetoric made him seem, but he was really, really excellent at channeling the energy of his supporters and, in fact, taking this somewhat inchoate group that was beginning to form a New Right coalition and becoming the point of their spear and helping to limit the kinds of things that they were willing to talk about. He was a militant foe Ronald Reagan wasn't necessarily in favor of a whole lot of things, but what he was a militant foe of a lot of things that had already been occurring. He was a militant foe of the enemies of the right wing. He was virulently anti-union, firing every air traffic controller in one fell swoop in 1981. He was unabashedly anti-communist in his foreign policy, regardless of how sensible it may have seemed at the time or even now. He established the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was the so-called missile shield, by which he wanted to outspend the Soviet Union on defense. He allowed CIA covert activities against many Central American radicals. He would support authoritarian regimes. Now, we have been doing this for a long time, but he unabashedly supported authoritarian regimes if they claimed anti-communism. He supported Israel without hesitation. In 1982, in order to intervene in a brewing battle between Israel and Syria, he deployed troops to Lebanon, which left relatively suddenly after a terrorist bomb exploded the following year. And in 1983, to overthrow the Cuba-leaning government of the island of Grenada, he used U.S. Marines to invade. This made a lot of the old Vietnam warriors, I don't mean the Vietnam vets, I mean people who thought we lost in Vietnam, very, very happy. We had finally won against a communist government on the island of Grenada. In addition, Ronald Reagan was a supply-side economist. This is the opposite of Keynesianism, which is the demand-side economics that have been practiced since the end of World War II in the United States, even by Eisenhower and Nixon. Reagan believed in trickle-down economics, that if you feed money into the upper crust, that they will spend money primarily in investments in building businesses. He wanted to reduce taxation to bolster the economy by concentrating income in the upper tier, who would then hire new workers. He suffered a recession and almost a depression, a severe downturn in the economy, but after that recovered in about 1984, then the economy grew without inflation into the 1990s. After there was a serious rise in the federal deficit, however, because he funded the growth of the economy not by taxes, but by borrowing, even though he was significantly increasing defense spending and even some social programs. On the other hand, he did reduce other social safety net spendings. And his policies tended to benefit the middle class of managers and technicians rather than the industrial working class. Unfortunately, the Reagan administration was rocked by a couple of major scandals, none of which actually attached to him. The first of these is the so-called Iran-Contra Scandal, in which the Reagan government sold arms, not Reagan himself, but people in the government, sold arms to Iran in contravention of American law, and then used that money to support anti-communist Contra troops in Nicaragua, even though Congress had specifically forbidden money to go to the Contra troops and had specifically forbidden arms sales to Iran. Iran needed arms sales because they were fighting against Iraq. Some of his underlings, particularly Oliver North, covered up and falsified documents and lied to Congress. Consequently, Oliver North was convicted of certain crimes, and he was. All of these, however, were overturned in court. And President Bush um, the elder pardoned a number of officials who had been connected to this scandal before any of them went on trial in 1992. Another major scandal that didn't stick to President Reagan was the savings and loan scandal, in which deregulation of the savings and loan industry allowed many S&Ls to make risky loans, many of which were either sweetheart loans, which were designed to fail, or they were just far too risky and they failed. The deregulation was like removing Glass-Steagall protections against the banking industry. It removed the type of deregulation that went on was the removal of the distinction between commercial savings and loans, which is where you and I might put our money, and investment savings and loans, which is venture capital. And just like the stock market crash of 1929, we saw the savings and loan crash because of that lack of distinction, lack of barrier between taking your and my money and putting it in extremely risky debentures. Well, this required a massive government bailout of the S&L industry in 1989, right after Reagan left office. None of these things stuck to Ronald Reagan. He left office as the Guion of the new right, their first president. He always said he wanted to be a game changer in the mold of Franklin Roosevelt, and doubtless that is how history will remember him. Now, the most important foreign policy thing we want to talk about the most important foreign policy thing we want to talk about is the ending of the Cold War, which we will do in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.